proud to be a woman.
Girls and women are
powerful,
beauty,
badass, feminine,
passion,
equality,
power, professional,
diligence,
advocates for change.
Welcome to She Plus, the female empowerment podcast that tells the extraordinary stories of everyday women. I'm your host, Elise Dean. On this episode of She Plus, we sat down with Verónica Del Valle, a graduate student journalist, and talked about all things journalism. Many of you know graduate school took up a large chunk of my time and my life this fall, so I wanted to bring you an episode that shares the behind the scenes of what journalism looks like through the eyes and the story of another journalist, Verónica. Verónica is a native New Jerseyan with a burning passion to tell stories. Tell us a little bit about first your background on and how you got here.
Okay, so I went to AU for undergrad. I was a applied government major, and I had transferred here from another school where I was a journalism major, and I had a really terrible experience and decided that I hated it. And then I got here, and I was like, wait, well, actually. And then I graduated college a year early and kind of didn't know what I wanted to do with my life and felt like I'd wasted 3 years not actually learning more about journalism and applied skill. So graduate school was an option, and I applied in February of my senior year of college and then ended up here somehow. Just like a lost child. But yeah, I'm really interested in telling stories about power and equity and infrastructure.
Let's back up here. Journalism lesson number 1. What does Verónica mean when she says she's interested in power, equity, and infrastructure? Well, that's what we call a beat in journalism school. You can think of a journalism beat like a genre of sorts. If you're a beat reporter, you are often placed to a specific genre or beat. You get intimately familiar with sources on that beat. Most, if not all, of your stories come from that beat. So take education as a beat, for example. Maybe sources are teachers or Department of Education employees. If you're in Chicago, maybe you write stories about the recent teacher strikes.
Chicago public school teachers are officially on strike, taking to the picket lines early this morning. The union and CPS have been negotiating for months over pay, prep time, class size, and even access to affordable housing.
Or if you're in California, you write about the proposed change to school start times.
Senate Bill 328 was signed into law by the governor, requiring all public middle schools to start no earlier than 8 a.m. and high school no earlier than 8:30. This after research shows more sleep can lead to better performance at school.
Okay, I think you get it now. Yeah, so what does that mean? Tell us, you say, I'm interested in covering power and equity as a journalist, and so if I'm reading the morning Sunday newspaper or the digital version of the newspaper, since that's where we're headed, and you have a byline on the front page, what does power and equity mean? What would your story be? Boom, that was a good question.
That was a really great question. Her journalism degree is showing. Power and equity are just the systems that cause people to interact in a certain way, to me. I think power and equity could be found in anything. I think the best example of this is the beat that I'm covering in Northern Virginia. I do a lot of stories about traffic infrastructure and bike lanes and parking lots, and you can see how power and equity play into those because resources get taken away from one group by another group, and it then creates a dynamic. So what I mean by power and equity is the dynamics that are instilled by the allocation of resources. So it could be political power and equity. So just like government, it could be issues of social justice. Education is a great place where you can see power and equity go out to play. I think roads and infrastructure and transit, another really great place. So it's all about greater systems. And that's kind of like the tension that I really, really think is cool.
And journalism lesson number 2. Don't invite a journalist to be on your podcast because they'll turn right around and turn the questions on you.
Elise, I have a question for you.
Oh, jeez. This is my podcast? Just kidding.
You invited journalists onto your podcast and you expect me not to ask questions.
That's fair. That's fair. All right. What's your question?
What would be like your ideal beat?
It's funny because I got asked this in an interview. I told them women's issues is what I'm really interested in covering. And she goes, well, what does that mean? Be a little bit more specific on women's issues. And I thought, yeah, women's issues is a little bit broad because there's a lot of them. And I have talked about a lot of them on this podcast and spoken with women who, have experienced them or proactively are talking about things like that. And I think that that's really interesting. But the ideal beat, yes, would be maybe to hop off of yours, power and equity and how it affects women.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's kind of like gender or women's issues is such a large kind of topical area. But I think when most reporters talk about women's issues, they're talking about the dynamics that play into gender. Mm-hmm. Whether it is the issues of cisgendered women or the issues of non-binary people or the issues of even trans men are heavily affected by the stereotype of women's issues because some trans men get their period. So when you say women's issues and you're trying to talk about kind of like reproductive health, you are accidentally leaving out a whole group of people that like get their period and are affected by these policies. So it's so interesting like how the term women's issues has kind of morphed, particularly in the last 5 years, because now when we say women's issues, it means something completely different than when our parents were young and women's issues meant like second wave feminist Gloria Steinem.
Beats can come as a result of being assigned to them or expertise, but they can also come as a result of interest. It seems only natural that I'm interested in reporting on women's issues, given that I put my blood, sweat, and tears into this very podcast. I'm excited that I started this podcast because I think it helps me get additional context that I need if I were to follow forward with a beat like this, where, I can actively relate certain conversations that I have on a regular basis back to somebody that I spoke to on this podcast. Mm-hmm. So in that same interview, they asked me to talk about my favorite story that I've since covered recently in the last couple of months or whatever. And I talked about how I recently covered this story about naloxone in DC and Narcan administration. And I was really, really proud of it because it kind of was two sides to the coin where it affects DC. It's a really big deal here. But also on the flip side, I talked to somebody on She Plus about this issue and how it affected her because her son overdosed. So it was kind of like full circle, really, really cool having it hit a lot of different things and be important to more than just the district, but also people. It like catapults. It's pretty cool. So
it's really cool how we're seeing this change in journalism where people feel more empowered to talk about experience outside of their direct reporting. Like, it's really cool that in that interview, you didn't just have to talk about the reporting you did for that Narcan story, but you were also able to talk about your personal experience in interviewing this woman.
Coming up after the break,
me being a Latina doesn't stop me from knowing things or stop me from understanding things. It adds to my understanding of things. And it's taken a long time, but I will not let anyone convince me otherwise.
Hey, you've all followed my journey with She Plus and might be thinking about starting your own podcast. Well, I'm here to tell you to use Anchor for yours. Let me explain. Anchor is a completely free platform that allows you to record and edit your episodes right from your computer. Easy, right? Well, that's actually not all. Anchor also sets you up for success by distributing your podcast to platforms like Spotify and Apple. You don't even have to lift a finger. And finally, you can make quick, easy money on Anchor, even if you have a smaller audience. It's everything you need all in one place. Anchor. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Welcome back. Journalism lesson number 3. When you go through graduate school for journalism, you're suddenly deeply entrenched in the news. Like, all the time. Shocker, right? Your free time soon consists of consuming news from outlets across the globe. Several of my professors at the beginning of the semester said that if I walked in without knowing the news of the day, I was already behind. It makes sense, though. If you're employed in the news, you should probably know the news. But for Verónica, she's lucky enough to be at the center of it all, working in one of the top newsrooms in the world. For my She Plus audience, what can you dive into and share with us about one of the nation's most important, valuable, most well-read newsrooms in the country, let alone the world? What can you share with us about the inside dealings of the Washington Post?
They have free K-cups.
That's important.
It is really important. Like, I came in on my first day shaking in my boots, like a little bit overdressed, and I like went into the kitchen and they just have like a drawer of free K-cups, and I was like, okay, I can hang here. Like, this is fine. It's everything you think it would be and nothing like what you would think it would be all at the same time. I forget that people that work in huge, important newsrooms like that are people, and I see them like walking around and watching YouTube videos on their computers and texting but also doing like hard, amazing, rigorous work. It's really humanizing in a really interesting way. And also everyone there is so kind and so accommodating and so helpful. It really is really humbling. Even yesterday, I kind of stumbled into a potential investigation through a friend of a friend or a girl I did a project with, and I didn't really know what to do, so I emailed my boss and I was like, hey, do you have time to sit down and talk to me, like just 10 minutes? I have some questions. And she was like, okay, like tell me all about it. And she was like, you should do this first and you should take this step and you should go to the Montgomery County courts and go look through this log. And I was like, oh, okay, like furiously jotting down everything she had to tell me. And I think that really speaks to the greater culture of the Post. I think especially right now in this time of journalism, they're really focused on fostering a strong young generation of journalists and also engaging a strong young audience, which is it's really a inspiring time and an inspiring thing to witness.
She can't share much about what she's investigating. It's top secret. But my bet is that you'll be reading about it pretty soon. She also happens to be working at the Post at what some might call a rather monumental time in history.
I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry.
President Trump.
Impeach President Trump.
Overreach of power.
The walls are closing in.
Explosive impeachment testimony.
Impeach, impeach, impeach.
It's just a travesty to the American people.
And she's located at the heart of where it's all happening, Washington. There's so much history, and it's like the center of a lot of things that are going on, and it's really cool. And I say this to a couple of people when I'm big on my DC energy of it amazes me how we can go into a hearing, and whether it be on the Senate side, the House side, whatever it is, and what decisions are made and what things go on in there and how we report about it, and all of these things kind of combine together to become something that's going to affect the country. It's going to affect literally everyone.
Wild. And I get so heated when people are a little lukewarm on DC. Actually, my boyfriend is kind of lukewarm on DC. He doesn't hate it. He'd be very upset if I said he hated it. But he's not mad about it. And I'm just like, how can you not like it here? It's so I mean, I also, at least once a week, I'm like, I hate this place. It's so hot. I hate the swamp.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. It is like 30 degrees outside. But I think just DC is such an unexplored avenue for so many people, and so many people want to write it off as like it's like a shell of a city.
That's
when
true.
there's like a really deep culture and history and kind of community here that for decades has been being historically erased because DC is now becoming like a hip and cool place. So like these kind of trenches of Black culture are kind of getting paved over, which is really sad to see. And I think part of our work as journalists is to expose that and preserve that.
For our fourth and final journalism lesson of today's episode, we discussed the role identity plays in journalism. Ethics is a core tenet of journalism. They literally drilled it into our brains at the start of school. But some still debate how your past lived experiences and your identity play a role into your reporting on a story. So for example, and take this lightly, I'm a white female who grew up in a privileged household. If I'm assigned to write a story about impoverished communities in DC, how might my previous experiences, or lack thereof, influence the way that I report that story? Here's what we learned. We started every single morning with an ethics discussion, debate, conversation type of thing with somebody who teaches at the school who's really, really well-versed in this and has a master's and PhD and whatnot. And she's really well-versed in this and helped us kind of like open our thoughts and eyes into stuff when it comes to identities in reporting. And she talked a lot about, you know, if you're queer, are you able to report on something, like are you able to report on when gay marriage became legal? Like, and
NPR said no.
Yeah, and so is your editor able to stop you and say, no, we don't want to put you on this? But it's like, that's how does that work? And so I think that kind of conversation, along with Veronica's, you know, her note to people listening, I think it's interesting because I think it's going to continue to change on the way and the conversation of ethics in journalism, because the world is changing as we know it all the time, and so many different things are happening, and journalism is always affected. But I do think it's interesting how identity does play a role in reporting, but also it's not as big of a role as you think, because you can be who you are, but also cover stuff. Like, I'm a woman. And yes, I have bias towards, like, woman rock, but if I'm reporting on something, like I reported something on The Hill, this is all a tangent, and this is, anyways, I reported something on The Hill a couple weeks ago about battered women, and like, I'm not going to sit there and be biased and say, well, all these people suck because they're not trying to fix this fast enough. That's not how it works. Like, some people, yes, of journalists are really bad examples that they just really don't know how to report. But albeit to say, we are good people and you should just trust the media. Okay, thanks.
So I think something going back to boot camp is something that we read. I highly endorse everyone reading this. It's called Missing the Story by Jelani Cobb, who is a professor at the Columbia Journalism School. He's a staff writer at the New Yorker. He is one of my journalistic icons. He wrote a story about how a New York Times reporter in the Metro section covered a series of robberies in the Bronx. And the article kind of boo-hoos at these people for refusing to give up their wallets to this robber. And this white journalist covered it in that specific light, but Jelani Cobb, who was a black man and had lived in a similar neighborhood before, saw it from a completely different perspective. He understood that for these low-income people, black and brown bodies in the Bronx, giving up your wallet could be the difference between you and buying groceries, between you and making it to work on time because you have a Metro card. Those are considerations that a white journalist who didn't live in the Bronx or who didn't have that understanding of a lower class struggle couldn't come to understand. So diversity in journalism and kind of identity in journalism isn't about objectivity. It's about getting the story or not getting the story.
And this is certainly not to say that a reporter is limited to reporting on what they know. In fact, that's actually kind of the opposite. It's a matter of taking all of those factors into account when you report. Like I said, people still debate this topic. So for Veronica, she's a female Latina journalist, so I asked her how her identity plays a role in her reporting. I think it's important for my listenership to know a little bit more about you as a female Hispanic journalist. How does your identity play a role in who you are, what you do, and do you have any advice for people who might be listening out there who are also female journalists, are also Hispanic journalists, are also both? What would you say to them?
Don't let people convince you that your identity stops you from being able to report on things and being able to be unbiased, because objectivity is a fake notion fundamentally. And our identities as human beings, my identity informs me as a reporter. It doesn't prohibit me. It adds to what I know about the world. And this has nothing to do with being Hispanic or a woman, but I think the best example of this is we were at a congressional hearing, and I was editor for the week, so I was reading someone's story, and they called a Congresswoman Bonnie Coleman, and this is the Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman from New Jersey, and she's very emphatic about being called Bonnie Watson Coleman. And I only knew that because I'm from New Jersey and part of her constituent base. So I think one can extrapolate that example to all aspects of one's life. Me being a Latina doesn't stop me from knowing things or stop me from understanding things. It adds to my understanding of things. And it's taken a long time, but I will not let anyone convince me otherwise. And I think that applies to any facet of identity.
So, even though we have all of these different identities and upbringings, they play a role in who we are. And as a journalist, it's our job to keep that in check when we cover certain topics. It's ignorant if we don't. So let's recap everything we've learned. Journalism is awesome, and so is Veronica. Be sure to look out for her reporting in both The Washington Post and NPR in 2020. And a bonus lesson for me, at least. When you have Veronica on the show, she's probably going to nominate your ethics professor.
I think you should try to get Margot Suska on the podcast.
Okay.
Margot Suska was our journalism ethics professor from this summer. She is so cool.
Thank you so much for being on She Plus. I'm glad to have you as a part of the She Plus community now.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. That's everything from us at She Plus. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on January 13th.